She was 22 years old and had nothing left but a canvas pack, a horsehair blanket, and a bone-handled drawknife wrapped in oilcloth that had belonged to a woman who was no longer alive to use it. No address, no family that would claim her, no money beyond the $3 folded into the lining of her coat pocket. And with those $3, she bought a derelict sawmill on the edge of the Gatineau Hills that had not run timber since before the war, and that everyone in the county agreed was good for nothing but firewood and regret. But what nobody knew, what she herself would not discover until the ice broke in April, was that beneath the floorboards of the mill's old office, someone had left something behind. Not by accident. And what was wrapped inside the oilskin parcel, and what was written in the hand on the envelope tucked beneath it, would change the entire shape of her life. If you're new here, welcome to Cabin Stories. Pull up a chair. This one is worth hearing to the very end. Her name was Winifred Gale, and she was born in the spring of 1889 in a farmhouse outside Pembroke, Ontario, the second of 4 children and the only daughter. Her father, Hugh Gale, was a millwright by trade, a man who understood the grammar of moving water, who could read a river the way other men read a ledger, and who built and maintained the small bush mills that fed lumber into the Ottawa Valley from a dozen creeks no one had bothered to name on any map. He was not a prosperous man. He was a precise one. The mill owners trusted him because he arrived when he said he would and never left a shaft out of true. Her mother, Betta, had taught school in Renfrew before her marriage and continued to keep the household accounts, afterward in a hand, so neat it could have been printed. The farmhouse always smelled of pine resin and bread dough, and the particular metallic cold of winter mornings when the water in the wash basin had iced over in the night. Winifred grew up in a house where usefulness was the highest compliment. You did not tell someone you loved them. You split their kindling. You darned their wool socks before the heel wore through. You came out before dawn to help them set the flue so the kitchen would be warm by the time the younger children came downstairs. Her brothers, Edwin, Paul, and the youngest, Arlo, were outdoor boys, rough and careless and forgiven for it, in the way that boys in that time and place were consistently forgiven for things that would have earned a girl a sharp word and a longer chore list. Winifred did not resent this exactly. She observed it the way you observe a recurring pattern in wallpaper, present, unchangeable, not worth fighting, but worth understanding. What she wanted, from as early as she could remember wanting anything, was to work wood. Not the domestic wood of furniture or floors, but structural wood, timber frames, millwork. The way a green log became a beam, and a beam became a building, and a building became the place where a family's life happened for 100 years. Her father began letting her come to the mills with him when she was 11. By the time she was 13, she could read the bevel on a cant with her eye alone and tell you within 2 degrees whether it would seat true. Hugh Gale did not praise her for this. He simply stopped sending her back to wait by the wagon. The woman who shaped Winifred most completely outside of her father was a woman named Eunice Foy. Eunice lived alone in a timber frame workshop at the edge of Pembroke, and she had been in various chapters of her long life, a boat builder, a furniture maker, a teacher of hand joinery to anyone patient enough to learn, and the widow of a man named Rolf Foy, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1901, and whom she spoke of with the matter-of-fact grief of someone who had had 20 years to make peace with a loss that never entirely stopped aching. Winifred knocked on Eunice Foy's workshop door when she was 14, holding a chair leg she had tried to turn on her father's lathe and could not get right. Eunice looked at the chair leg. She looked at Winifred. She said, "Come in." Set it on the bench. She did not come in. She told Winifred exactly what she had done wrong, which took about 3 minutes, and then she said, "Come back Saturday and bring your own gouges if you have them. If you don't, you'll use mine and you'll sharpen them before you leave." Winifred came back every Saturday for 7 years. Eunice taught her to read wood the way other people learned to read text, not just the surface grain, but the story inside it, which trees had grown fast and which had grown slow, and why that mattered when you were choosing stock for a bearing joint versus a decorative piece. She taught her to use a drawknife and a spokeshave, and a shoulder plane and a mortise chisel, and to sharpen all of them to a degree of keenness that could pare end grain as cleanly as a razor. She taught her to identify the properties of a dozen species by touch and smell alone. White oak's weight and its tight, reliable grain. The way butternut worked like butter when it was dry, but punished you for impatience. The particular sweetness of cedar that told you it would resist moisture and insects for decades without complaint. Eunice had an opinion about most things and shared it without much ceremony. She told Winifred once, on a hot August afternoon, when they were working opposite ends of a long tenon saw, and the sawdust was thick in the air, and the workshop smelled of sweat and pine, that the most reliable thing a woman could build was her own competence. Not a reputation, she said. Not a marriage. Not a position in the community. Competence. Because competence was the one thing you carried inside yourself, and that no flood, no fire, no man with a pen and a legal opinion could take out of your hands. Winifred did not know at the time how specifically useful that advice would turn out to be. Eunice Foy died in the autumn of 1912, quietly, in her sleep, with her boots on the mat beside the bed and a half-finished mortise gauge on the workbench, and a pot of cold tea on the stove that had gone cold sometime in the night. She left Winifred her drawknife, bone-handled, Swedish steel, worn to a perfect patina by 30 years of Eunice's grip, and a small journal, bound in brown calf leather, filled with joinery notes, timber calculations, and observations about wood and weather, and the particular patience required to do good work. The pages were dense and close-written and occasionally illustrated with pencil diagrams so precise they could have been used as working drawings. Winifred wrapped the drawknife in the same oilcloth. Eunice had kept it in and put it in her canvas pack beside the journal. Together, they were her inheritance. Not land, not money, not a name that anyone in the county would recognize as belonging to a family of consequence, but knowledge made physical. Tools that fit her hands. The voice of a person who had believed she was capable of more than anyone else had yet asked her to be. The morning Winifred was put out of her family's house was a Wednesday in March of 1913. The river ice was still solid. The snow was deep and crusted over from a thaw and freeze, and it held her weight, and then cracked without warning, and let her boot through to the knee, which is a particular kind of cold that stays with you. Her father, Hugh Gale, had died the previous spring, an infection in his hand that spread before anyone understood how serious it was. And that was over in 11 days, in a way that left all of them stunned and slightly disbelieving, as though the world had changed the rules without announcing it. Winifred's mother had managed the first year with the tightness and precision of someone holding a difficult seam under pressure, and then, in the autumn, she had accepted the proposal of a man named Clement Straw. Clement Straw was 51 years old. He had come to Pembroke from somewhere in the Ottawa Valley's east end. Hawkesbury, people said, though no one seemed to have confirmed this, and had set himself up as an insurance agent, which, in those years in that place, was a profession that occupied an uncomfortable position between useful and suspect. He wore a vest with a watch chain and had the permanent smell of bay rum and something beneath it, sweeter, that Winifred could never quite name. He was not violent, he was not dramatic. He was simply a man who had arranged his life according to a set of specifications that had not previously included a grown stepdaughter, who smelled of wood shavings and held opinions about timber framing, and who had a habit of going to another woman's workshop every Saturday and coming home with sawdust in her hair and a look on her face that he found, in his word, unsettling. He did not like that she read her father's engineering manuals. He did not like that she kept her tools in the spare room, oiled and hung in order on a board she had mounted on the wall herself. He did not like that she answered questions directly, and without the half-second delay that he seemed to expect from women before they spoke, as though the delay itself were a form of deference he was owed. He told Winifred's mother that the girl needed direction. Winifred's mother, who was tired and frightened and grateful to have someone else making decisions for a while, agreed. Winifred's brothers left one at a time. Edwin first, to a surveying crew working the north shore of Lake Huron. Paul to a cousin in Toronto who had a printing business. Arlo, the youngest, to an apprenticeship with a steamfitter in Arnprior who had known their father. Each departure was a small reduction in the warmth of the house. A window closed. By the time Winifred was 22, it was just her and her mother and Clement Straw, and the house smelled of his pipe tobacco and the particular staleness of rooms where nobody laughed anymore. The morning she was put out, she came downstairs to find her pack on the porch. Her tools, all of them, were inside it. Her blanket, Eunice's drawknife in its oilcloth, the leather journal. Her winter coat was on the hook by the door. On top of the pack was an envelope with her name on it in Clement Straw's handwriting. Neat, even, the handwriting of a man who wrote letters for a living. Inside the envelope, $3 in bills, folded once, and a note written on his business letterhead that read, "Winifred, it has been decided that your presence here is no longer practical for the household. Your mother has agreed this arrangement is for the best. The enclosed should cover your immediate needs. Please do not expect further assistance from this address." See straw. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket. She did not knock on the door. She did not call her mother's name through the kitchen window, though she could see the shape of her mother at the stove and could have. She looked at the house for a long moment. The porch boards her father had laid, the parlor window with its crack in the lower pane that he had always meant to replace. And then she lifted her pack, settled it onto her shoulders, and walked down off the porch and out the gate and onto the road that led north. She was 22 years old. She had $3, a bone-handled drawknife, a leather journal, and a blanket. She did not look back, not because she didn't know where she was, not because she was made of something harder than grief, but because she understood with a particular clarity that only the people who have already lost the most important thing understand that what was behind her could not be changed by looking at it, and that somewhere ahead of her, something was waiting that she had not yet found the name for. She walked north because north was where the bush was, where the land was less settled and the towns were smaller, and the questions people asked about who you were and where you came from were slightly less pointed than in the valley where everyone had known her father, and now, apparently, knew Clement Straw. She walked for 2 days. The first night, she slept in the tack room of a livery stable outside de Rivières, on a pile of horse blankets that smelled of sweat and lanolin and the particular dusty warmth of large animals in winter. And it was better than nothing, which is the most generous thing you can honestly say about sleeping in a strange livery stable in March. The second night, she slept in a church hall that left its side door unlocked for exactly the purpose she was using it for, which told her something about the people who lived there. On the third day, she came to a place called Brûlé Crossing. It was not much of a town, a general store, a post office operating out of one room of the storekeeper's house, a blacksmith who also shod horses and looked the part entirely, a grist mill on the creek, a small hotel with 4 rooms that were almost never all occupied at once, and a dining room that served 2 things for breakfast and the same 2 things for supper, with different gravy. The store was run by a woman named Harriet Obe, who was 67 years old and had the quality of someone who had watched enough of the world pass through her door that very little of it required comment anymore. She looked at Winifred, at her boots, at her hands, at the way she set her pack down carefully and did not let the tools inside it knock against the floor, and she said, without any particular ceremony, "What can you do?" Winifred told her. She could frame, she said. She could cut joinery. She could build a form-true cabinet or a stair or a window frame or a bent for a timber building. She could read a structure and tell you what was failing in it and why, and she could fix most of it given the right stock and enough time. Harriet Obe listened to this with her arms folded and her eyes steady. Then she said, "There's a mill property about 3 miles up the creek, old Vaillancourt sawmill. Hasn't run in 11 years. County's been trying to clear the deed for years. Last I heard, they were asking $3 to be rid of the paperwork." $3, Winifred said, "for the building and the land. About 30 acres. The mill machinery is there, but I don't know what's left of it. The log pond has been dry since the creek shifted. The office building is standing. The main mill shed has a partial roof. The house, the caretaker's cabin they called it, is in better shape than the mill, or was last anyone went up there, which was probably 4 years ago." Winifred was quiet for a moment. $3 was everything she had. "Who do I see about the deed?" she said. The Vaillancourt property was 3 miles up a creek road that had not been graded since before the war, and the snow was deep enough that she went in on a pair of borrowed snowshoes that Harriet Obe kept behind the counter on a nail, for reasons she did not explain and that Winifred did not ask about. The snowshoes were old, the rawhide webbing loose in 2 places, but they held. The mill shed was the first thing she saw from the creek road, a long timber frame structure, 40 feet or better, with a corrugated iron roof that had held on the west half and collapsed on the east, taking a section of the wall framing down with it. The timber posts were still standing, hand-hewn pine, 12 by 12, set in stone pads that had not moved. She pressed her gloved hand against the nearest post, solid. The main mill machinery was still inside, a large circular saw on an iron carriage, rusted but intact, the blades seized to the arbor but removable. The carriage track was sound iron, and the frame was old-growth timber that had darkened with age and oil to the color of strong tea. In the pit below the saw, where the water wheel had once driven the line shaft, there was nothing but old leaves and a family of mice who had made themselves at home in the pulley housing. The office building was a small structure attached to the south end of the mill, shed by a covered walkway. The walkway roof was gone, but the posts were standing. The office itself was single-story, maybe 16 feet by 20, built of squared timber with a stone chimney and a plank floor. The door hung true on its hinges, which told her the foundation had not shifted. The windows were intact, small, four-pane, wavy glass windows that let in a gray and slightly distorted version of the February light outside. Inside, there was a desk of some kind. Not furniture, just a plank on sawhorses, the plank itself warped past use. A rusted stove in the corner, small, an office stove, the kind you kept burning all day on a scuttle of coal just to keep the pipes from freezing. A wooden chair with one leg repaired with a piece of strap iron and a bolt, the repair so solid it would likely outlast the original. Shelves along the north wall, holding nothing now but the ghosts of ledgers, the paper rot of old record books, and 3 mason jars with lids so oxidized they had welded themselves to the glass. The floor was wide plank, spruce, and she walked its length and listened to it. No soft spots, no sag. She was looking for the feel of a floor that had integrity, and this one had it, even under 11 years of dust and mouse activity and the particular abandonment that leaves a smell you recognize without being able to name. The caretaker's cabin was 50 yards back from the mill, set against the hillside where a stand of old-growth white pine blocked the north wind. It was a small log building, squared logs chinked with a mortar that had cracked in places but held in most, with a cedar shake roof that was mossy but intact and a stone chimney that stood straight. The door was barred from the outside with a drop-peg latch, the kind you could lift with a stick through a hole beside the door, which told her the last person to leave had done so intending to come back. Inside, a plank floor, a stone hearth, a cast-iron stove, 2 built-in bunks against the east wall, a small table, a shelf with 3 tin cups and a cracked saucer and a stub of candle in a dish. The windows were covered with boards nailed over the frames from the outside, which had kept the weather out. The air inside was cold and still, and had the smell of old wood smoke and dried spruce needles, and the faint sweetness of a place that has been closed a long time but has not rotted. She walked back to the mill. She walked the perimeter of the property on her snowshoes, through the snow-heavy bush, counting her paces, calculating. The creek still ran, smaller now since the shift, but clean and cold. The timber on the hillside above the cabin was mature white pine, the kind of pine that had been making people rich and then poor again in the Ottawa Valley for 60 years. And there was enough of it to run a small portable mill for a season if she could get the machinery moving again. She went back to Harriet Obe's store and put her $3 on the counter. "I'll take it," she said. Harriet Obe looked at her for a long moment. That look that is neither pity nor admiration, but holds some of both, and got out the county deed register and wrote up the transfer on a half sheet of paper, and Winifred Gale pressed her $3 flat on the counter. The $3 that Clement Straw had enclosed in his notice of eviction, the sum total of his estimate of her worth. And she signed her name, and the Vaillancourt property was hers. She carried her pack up the creek road in the late afternoon light, the shadows of the spruce stretching long and blue across the snow. Her breath coming in small clouds, the snowshoes creaking with each step on the crusted surface. She pried the board off the cabin window with a stick she found by the creek, lifted the drop peg on the door, and went inside. She set her pack on the plank floor and stood still for a moment in the cold gray light and listened. The stove would need cleaning, the chimney needed inspection, the floor needed sweeping. The gap in the east wall chinking, needed filling with fresh mortar before another hard frost. There was no food, no fuel, no lamp oil. Outside, the temperature was dropping, and the sky had gone the color of pewter that means more snow before morning. She thought, "This is mine. Not lent, not permitted, not inherited from someone who already belonged here, bought, with the only $3 in the world that were hers to spend. Money that had been sent as a severance, as a final accounting between herself and people who should have seen her clearly and had chosen not to. She had turned it into something else, not a closing, an opening, not the end of a story. The first line of one she would write herself, in her own hand, in a language that was built of oak and pine, and the particular honesty of things made with care. She built a fire in the stove. With kindling she split from a piece of scrap spruce she found under the eave of the mill shed, using the back of her drawknife as a froe, which was not its proper purpose but worked. She slept the first night on the lower bunk in her blanket and her coat. And in the morning the stove was cold, but the cabin was not, because the log walls held heat differently than board and batten houses do, with a steadiness that felt almost like a personality. She decided she liked the cabin. She spent the first weeks doing what Eunice Foy had taught her to do with any structure she was unfamiliar with. She learned it from the ground up. She shoveled the snow away from the foundation logs to inspect for rot and found none. She cleared the chimney with a brush she made from spruce boughs tied to a pole, and it drew clean on the first fire. She re-chinked the east wall with a mix of lime and sand that Harriet Obe sold her on credit. Harriet had, without being asked, extended Winifred a line of credit at the store, without any discussion of terms or security, which Winifred noted and did not forget. She pulled the boards off all the windows. She cleaned the mill office stove and lit it, and found that it drew well and would hold heat through a night on 2 sticks of hardwood, if you banked it right. She began clearing the east half of the mill shed, pulling down the collapsed roof iron section by section and stacking it outside in the snow, and beneath the debris she found the mill floor intact. Wide spruce planks, the tongue and groove milled by the same machinery that still sat in the center of the building, solid and waiting. It was in the 3rd week of March, when the snow was beginning to go soft at the edges of the day, that she turned her attention to the office floor. She had noticed something on the 3rd day, a section of the plank floor near the north wall, where the boards did not sit quite flat, where one plank had a slight rise along its edge that spoke of either bad laying or something beneath. She had noted it and moved on, the way you make note of a thing you intend to return to when more pressing things are handled. Now she knelt on the floor with Eunice's drawknife and worked the tip of it into the gap between the boards along the raised edge, moving slowly, the way Eunice had taught her. No forcing, let the tool find the line. The boards had been face-nailed, and the nails had rusted. But the rust had not bonded them as completely as the rust in younger wood sometimes does. She worked the blade along the joint and felt the resistance give, and then she got her fingers under the edge of the board and lifted, and it came up, not violently, but with the quiet release of something that had been waiting for permission. Beneath the plank was not the crossbeam subfloor she expected. Instead, there was a cavity, perhaps 14 inches long and 10 inches wide, lined on 3 sides with pieces of cedar shingle set on edge, the cedar still fragrant after 11 years in the dark. The bottom of the cavity was a flat stone, and on the stone, wrapped in oilskin tied with a length of waxed twine, was a parcel about the weight of a good book. She sat back on her heels. She looked at it for a long time. The oilskin was dark with age but intact. She carried it to the window where the March light came in pale and clear, and she set it on the window ledge and untied the twine. Inside the oilskin were 3 things. The first was a canvas pouch, the kind a man might keep tobacco in, drawn tight with a cord. The second was a small tin box, about the size of a pocket Bible, with a fitted lid that had been sealed around its edge with beeswax that had yellowed but not cracked. The third was a letter, folded into quarters, wrapped in a separate piece of waxed paper and sealed with a drop of red wax that bore the impression of a thumb rather than a seal. She opened the canvas pouch first. Inside, coins, not silver, gold. Dominion gold pieces, $5 coins with the king's profile worn slightly soft from handling but perfectly legible. She counted them carefully, once, and then again. There were 19. $95 in gold coin, which was more money than her father had brought home in any single year of his working life. More money than Clement Straw kept in the tin box in his bedroom wardrobe that she had never looked in but knew existed. More money than she had ever held or expected to hold in her hands. She set the coins in a careful row on the window ledge and opened the tin box. Inside, on a bed of folded flannel, was a compass. Not a surveyor's instrument, something more personal. A pocket compass, brass-cased, with a hand-engraved compass rose on the lid and a small glass window over the needle. The engraving was fine work, done by someone who knew how to hold a graver, and around the rose were 4 letters, one at each point. N-S-E, and on the west, not W but a letter H. She turned it over. On the back, engraved in smaller letters, for O.V., so you always know the way home. V. 1899. She held it in her palm and felt the slight weight of it, the warmth that metal takes on quickly from a human hand. She set it gently beside the coins and picked up the letter. She broke the wax seal carefully and unfolded the paper. It was heavy stock, the kind used for mill contracts and legal records. The handwriting was upright and careful, the French-English mix of a man who thought in both and wrote in whichever came first. The letter read, "My name is Oswald Vaillancourt, and I am writing this on the 12th of November, 1902, in the office of the mill my father built, and that I have tried to run for 23 years with more stubbornness than sense. I am 54 years old. My wife Marguerite died of a fever in the spring. My son Henri was killed in a logging accident on the Gatineau in August. I have no other children. I do not intend to sell the mill to the men from Montreal who have been writing me letters since the summer, because I know what they will do with it and what they will do with the land. I intend to let it sit until someone worthy of it finds it. The coins in this pouch are the savings of 20 years. Marguerite and I put aside a little each season, after the bills were paid, and the men were paid, and the equipment was seen to. There was never much in any single year, but it grew the way timber grows, slowly, and without making a fuss about it, and then one day you look up, and there is something there that wasn't there before, and it is substantial. I had intended it for Henri. The compass was made for me by Marguerite in the first year of our marriage. She could not engrave herself, but she paid a watch repairer in Pembroke to do it. She said H was for home, and that as long as I carried it, I would always know in which direction home was. I have carried it every day since. I am putting it down now for the first time in 23 years, and my hand does not want to release it. But I would rather it be here, where it will be found by someone who needs it, than lost or sold with the rest. To whoever finds this, I do not know who you are, or when, or what will have brought you to this mill. But if you have come thus far, you have need of shelter, and if you have found this floor, you have need of something more. Take what is here. Take the coins and use them to fix the roof and clear the machinery and get the mill running again. The timber on the upper slopes is mature and has not been touched in 11 years. There is a portable frame mill in the shed behind the cabin under a tarpaulin, still in working order as of this writing. I saw to it myself last spring. The creek is low since it shifted, but it is sufficient for a modest operation and for a household. I built this mill with my father, and ran it with my wife, and tried to leave it to my son, and all three of them are gone now, and the mill is still standing, which tells me something about the patience of wood that I have not yet fully understood. I only ask this, that someone live here, that someone cut timber from this hillside honestly, and replant where they take from, as we always did. That someone light a fire in that stove, and cook a meal in that cabin, and walk in the bush above the creek in the spring, when the trilliums are up. Marguerite loved the trilliums. She said they were the bush reminding you it was still alive. I hope you will be well here. I hope you will find what you need. Oswald Vaillancourt, written in his own hand in the office of the Vaillancourt mill, on a cold morning in November. Winifred read the letter twice, and then a third time. On the third reading, her eyes blurred, and she set the letter on the window ledge and pressed her hands flat against the cold glass and stood still for a very long time. She did not cry dramatically. She had not cried dramatically when her father died, or when her mother had stood in the kitchen and not opened the door to let her back in. She cried the way people cry when they have been carrying a weight so long they have stopped noticing it, and something or someone sets it down for them without warning, and the sudden absence of it is almost unbearable. Quietly, with relief that has no words, with a gratitude too large to fit into language. She did not spend the gold quickly. She had not grown up with money, and she had not grown up with the habit of imagining it permanent. She understood that the value of what Oswald Vaillancourt had put under that floor lay not in what it could buy in a single day, but in what it could sustain over months and seasons and years. She went to Harriet Obe's store the next morning and paid her account in full, with 1 gold coin, and received her change in silver, and felt the particular vertigo of being a person who could settle a debt without calculating whether the payment would mean going short somewhere else. She told Harriet about the mill floor, not about the gold, not about the letter, just that she had found the frame mill under the tarpaulin in good condition, and that she was going to need cedar shakes and 50 pounds of lime and a supply of hardwood for the cabin stove, and possibly a hand to help her lift the saw carriage back onto its track. Harriet Obe listened with her hands flat on the counter, and then she said that there was a man named Fernand Brulé, no relation to the town's name, or possibly a very distant relation. No one had ever satisfactorily sorted this out, who had been a millwright before his knees went bad, and who still consulted on mill work when someone asked him respectfully and didn't rush him. She said if Winifred wanted to talk to him, she would send word. Fernand Brulé was 69 years old, with large, scarred hands, and the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that slowness and precision were the same thing. He came to the Vaillancourt property on a Friday afternoon, walked the mill shed twice without speaking, climbed on a beam to look at the line shaft housing, came back down and said, "The arbor is seized, but it's not cracked. Kerosene, then cold pressing. I can show you." She told him she was willing to learn. He looked at her the way Harriet Obe had looked at her, and then he nodded. "Monday," he said. "Bring your own gloves, good ones." They started Monday. Fernand showed her how to free a seized arbor with patience and penetrating oil and the correct application of force. Not hammering, which damages the bearing surface, but steady pressing with a bar and a block of hardwood positioned exactly right. He showed her how to realign the saw carriage on its track, checking the level with a long straight edge and shimming with thin cedar strips until the carriage ran true in both directions. He showed her how to true a large circular blade with a hammer and a small anvil, tapping out the high spots by sound as much as by eye, listening for the note that meant the blade was in tension rather than out of it. On the fourth day, a man named Jacques Terrien appeared at the mill with a shoulder of smoked pork wrapped in cloth and a jug of cider. Jacques was 46 years old, the son of a man who had cut timber for the Vaillancourt mill in its working years. And he had a face that looked like it had been carved, rather than grown, angular and darkened, with eyes that held a permanent expression of patient good humor. He set the pork on the mill office desk and said, in the bilingual shorthand of the Ottawa Valley, "Fernand told me there was a girl up here putting Vaillancourt's mill back together. I thought you might be hungry." He came back 2 days later with a bag of dried beans and a wedge of cheese, and the day after that, he brought his son Rémi, who was 20 and built like a young tree. And Rémi looked at the east roof of the mill shed and said he could re-roof it himself if she bought the iron. And he started the following Tuesday and finished it in 6 days, working with the speed and indifference to cold of someone who had spent his whole life outdoors and found the inside of buildings slightly suspicious. A woman named Violet Pierce, who kept a small dairy farm on the other side of the creek road, brought her a pound of butter and a dozen eggs and said that she had sold milk to Oswald Vaillancourt's wife for 15 years and that the least she could do was see the new owner of the property. Didn't go hungry while she got herself sorted. A man named Claude Hebert, who had the grist mill on the north end of Brûlé Crossing, came by with a sack of oatmeal and stayed to look at the machinery and had within 20 minutes formed opinions about the line shaft alignment that he shared at length, some of which turned out to be correct. A girl of about 12 named Sophie Terrien, Jacques' daughter, came one afternoon with a jar of her mother's maple syrup and stayed for 3 hours watching Winifred work the drawknife on a replacement timber for the shed framing and asked so many precise and interesting questions that Winifred eventually put a tool in her hands and showed her the grip. Each person who came brought something specific. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody organized anything. It was simply how a community in the bush operated. The steady accumulation of small practical acts, each one a word in a conversation that had been going on between neighbors in that valley for 2 and 3 generations, through seasons of good timber and seasons of poor timber, and one war, and the influenza and the slow grinding of every kind of loss that people absorb over time and continue past. The weeks became months. The mill roof was repaired. The saw carriage ran true. Winifred rebuilt the waterway intake. The creek was lower since its shift but still sufficient. Rehanging the intake gate on new iron pintles she ordered from a foundry in Pembroke and fitting the sluice boards herself with mortised joints that would hold without bolts. She replastered the cabin walls with a lime hair mix. She made herself the way Eunice's journal described, packing it into the cracks in the old log jointing and floating the surface to something close to smooth. She made new window frames for the mill office, hand-planed, mortised and tenoned at the corners, the joints draw board with wooden pins, and reglazed them with glass she bought from a glazier in Brûlé Crossing, who did not seem surprised to have someone ask him to teach them how to bed the panes properly. She built new shelves for the cabin of pine boards she cut and planed herself on the portable mill she had found under the tarpaulin, which ran well. Once Fernand had checked the blade set and declared it satisfactory. She cut firewood, more than she needed for the rest of the winter, stacking it along the south wall of the cabin in rows tight enough to keep the rain out of the interior of the pile. She found, in early May, when the snow was finally gone and the creek was running high and brown with snowmelt, a stand of white trilliums on the hillside above the cabin, exactly where Oswald Vaillancourt's letter had said they would be, coming up through the dead leaf mat in their hundreds, in the particular white, that is not snow white but something more living, more intentional, more like a small and quiet declaration. She stood among them for a long time. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar and the cold runoff from the upper slopes. She thought about Marguerite Vaillancourt, who had loved this hillside and who had made her husband a compass so he would always know which direction was home, and who had been gone for 11 years, and whose love for this place had outlasted her in the form of a letter buried under a plank floor and the trilliums that came back every spring without anyone asking them to. By June, she was cutting timber, small sales, to begin with, board lumber to local farms, and the construction going on at the north end of Brûlé Crossing where a new church was being built. Fernand Brûlé came twice a week to watch her work, and to correct her when she was wrong, and to say nothing when she was right, which she had come to understand was the highest form of approval available to a man of his particular temperament. Jacques Terrien hired on part-time, and Claude Hebert's son Patrice came 3 days a week after he had finished at the grist mill. People in Brûlé Crossing knew her name now. Harriet Aube called her Miss Gale, and had extended her account and closed it and extended it again, and would, Winifred suspected, simply keep doing this indefinitely. Violet Pierce brought butter every second week and stayed for tea, and talked about her dairy herd with the same depth of knowledge and feeling that Winifred brought to timber, and their conversations had the particular richness of two people who have each gone very deep in their own direction, and find, unexpectedly, that the directions converge. Sophie Terrien came every Saturday to learn joinery, and she was not merely good at it. She was the kind of naturally gifted who would, in years, exceed her teacher, and both of them knew it and were pleased about it. Winifred was not wealthy. She was not comfortable in the way people mean when they say the word without thinking about it. But she was warm and fed and occupied and, increasingly, known, not as Clement Straw's stepdaughter, or even as Hugh Gale's daughter, but as herself, as the woman who had bought the Vaillancourt mill and put it back together, and was running it honestly and replanting where she took, as the letter had asked her to. On an evening in late July, when the light lasted past 9 o'clock, and the air was warm and full of the smell of sawdust and wild bergamot, and the distant cold edge of the creek, Winifred sat in the cabin doorway in a chair she had made herself. A simple joined chair, pegged and wedged, the seat woven with ash splints the way Eunice's journal described, and she looked out at the mill and the hillside and the last light on the upper spruce. Oswald Vaillancourt's letter was in the tin box on the shelf inside, beside the brass compass with its engraved H for home, and beside Eunice Foy's leather journal, and beside her father's. Well, Eunice's drawknife in its oilcloth, which she thought of as her father's in the way you sometimes transfer ownership of a feeling across people when the person you originally felt it for is no longer present to receive it. These 4 things sat on the shelf in a row, and they constituted, between them, her inheritance and her instruction. She thought about Oswald Vaillancourt, who had built his life in this bush with a wife he loved enough to carry a compass nets engraved with her initial for 23 years, and who had lost her and his son and everything except the mill and the timber and the hope he had buried in a pouch under a plank, hoping that someone would find it who deserved it. She thought about Eunice Foy, who had sat across a workbench from her every Saturday for 7 years and had given her, in the form of lessons about wood and tools and the nature of honest work, the understanding that competence was a form of freedom that nothing external could revoke. She thought about her father, Hugh Gale, who had let her stand beside him when she was 11 and not sent her back to wait by the wagon, which was, in that world and that family, the same thing as saying, "You belong here." She thought about her mother, Bet, who had been frightened and tired and had let Clement Straw make a decision that was not his to make. She thought about her mother without anger, which was not the same as forgiveness, but was, she suspected, the road. She did not think about Clement Straw. There was no room in a life well built for rooms, furnished with people who had tried to diminish you. The mind, like a timber frame, had a finite number of joints, and you chose carefully what you put weight on. She looked at the mill in the last light. She looked at the hillside. She listened to the creek, and the last birds settling into the spruce at the edge of the property, and the sound of the bush, going quiet in the particular way it goes quiet in the Ottawa Valley in July, which is not silent but full of small sounds layered over each other, until the whole thing becomes something like music, if you are willing to listen for it. She felt something she had not felt since she was 11 years old, standing in a cold mill shed beside her father, while he read the bevel on a cant hook with his eye, and she watched him and tried to see what he saw. The feeling of being precisely where she was supposed to be, of doing the work she was made to do, in a place that knew her name, not because she had been born there, or because she had been given it, but because she had bought it with everything she had, and rebuilt it with her own hands and earned, one season at a time, the right to belong to it. Winifred Gale was 22 years old when Clement Straw put her pack on the porch and slid $3 into an envelope. She had no home, no family that would answer if she knocked, no money except what the envelope contained. She walked north for 2 days and spent those $3 on a derelict sawmill in the Gatineau Hills that everyone in the county had agreed was past saving. Under the floor of the mill office, she found what an old man had put there, for a stranger he had not yet met and would never meet, his savings, his wife's compass, and a letter that asked only for someone to make the place live again. It was the best $3 she ever spent. We wonder sometimes about the Oswald Vaillancourts of the world, the ones who bury something in the dark and write a letter to no one and trust that the right person will find it. It seems like a kind of faith, doesn't it? Not the religious kind, but the quieter kind, the kind that says, I cannot fix this myself, I cannot be here for it, but I can leave something behind for the person who comes after, and I can trust that such a person exists. We think maybe that's all any of us can do in the end. What has someone left behind for you? Something you found when you needed it most, that you didn't expect, from someone who couldn't have known you were coming. Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear it.